First of all, we have Lucy Kent, who's Dr. Lucy Kent, recently awarded her PhD at the University of Cambridge. It's a PhD about early 20th century mysticism and modern art in Britain, which parts of have inspired this conference and certainly inspired a lot of my remarks today. Then we will have Clare Nadal, who is a joint doctoral candidate between the University of Huddersfield and this institution, Hepworth Wakefield. She's working on Hepworth and more, I think, in a slightly later period. So we'll talk about slightly later religious beliefs. And then finally, Elizabeth Fisher, former curator of Kettle's Yard, is going to talk to us about Jim Eade and various forms of religion, his work, his collecting practices, part of her doctoral thesis, currently in process at the University of Cambridge. So, Lucy.
Thank you. The fact that Ben Nicholson, his first wife Winifred Nicholson, and his second wife Barbara Hepworth were interested in Christian Science is often mentioned in the literature. However, it is rarely treated as anything more than a biographical curiosity. The tendency has been to downplay its importance in their lives, and historians have been wary of drawing any direct parallels between the doctrine and the works themselves. There are many reasons for exercising caution when it comes to discussing the religious connotations of modern art, as Sam has demonstrated for us all this morning. In the case of these three artists, however, there is an overwhelming amount of archival evidence in the form of books, letters, and personal notebooks that attest to the fact that Christian Science was a significant influence in each of their lives for almost the entirety of their careers. Furthermore, their writings make it clear that they each understood their creative output as an extension of their religious beliefs. Praise is the true name for art, wrote Winifred, and Barbara echoed, "A sculpture should be an act of praise, an enduring expression of the divine spirit." Ben insisted on more than one occasion that painting and religion were the same thing. In the 30s, he complained to Winifred that Herbert Reed's assessment of his work lacked, quote, "the very necessary Christian Science idea to clarify and give it substance." In the 40s, he told the critic Hartley Ramsden that the constructive movement he was promoting in England was, quote, "closer to the true Christian Science idea than any other kind of art." And in the 60s, he reiterated this belief to Herbert Reed that painting and Christian Science were corresponding means of discovering an unseen spiritual reality. Winifred was first introduced to the faith by Paul Nash's wife, Margaret, during the early 1920s, and she remained a believer until her death in 1981. Ben, who had first learned of Christian Science during a trip to America in 1918, also became a committed follower of Eddy's teachings during the mid-1920s. Letters in the Tate Archive reveal that he continued to seek spiritual guidance from Christian Scientists until as late as 1975. Hepworth's parents became Christian Scientists during her early adolescence. Her interest in the faith was then significantly deepened and consolidated through her relationship with Ben after 1931, and archival documents demonstrate that she was contacting Christian Science practitioners until at least 1969. This is not to suggest that Christian Science was the only influence, nor was it even the only spiritual influence that they engaged with. Hepworth had a wide range of religious, scientific, and philosophical interests, from psychoanalysis to Buddhism, and as Clare will discuss later, maintained ties with the Anglican Church alongside her Christian Science beliefs. Ben and Winifred's interests were also eclectic, but it is clear that Christian Science was a formative and long-lasting influence in each of their lives, as well as one that provided a philosophical point of contact between the three of them. In 1875, the founder of Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, outlined her philosophy in a book called Science and Health. Several of Hepworth's annotated copies of the book can be found here at the Wakefield. In her text, Eddy argues that there are two conceptions of reality. One, which is governed by what she calls mortal mind, and another, which adheres to the laws of immortal or divine mind, which is synonymous with God. Mortal mind, guided by the physical senses, creates a false, materialistic understanding of reality. Divine mind, by contrast, is guided by spiritual intuition, the true and perfect nature of reality, and the infinite and harmonious universal substance of which all things are a part. In Christian Science, all that is flawed or incongruent, such as sickness, disfigurement, and death, is understood as a misconception, an illusion of mortal mind. Acknowledging matter as a product of human error and considering the world as a spiritual whole brings the believer back into a natural state of health and harmony with the universe, governed by the eternal laws of divine mind. In Eddie's view, it was because Jesus understood that matter does not exist that he was able to transcend it, to rise from the dead, and to heal the sick. These acts, she insisted, were not miracles, but simply revelations of divine truth. While I won't have time for much in-depth analysis, I would like to discuss some of the ways in which the influence of Christian Science can be discerned in the symbolism, design, and function of the work that these artists produced while they were actively engaging with the faith. To begin with an example of symbolism, an understanding of Christian Science sheds light on Nicholson's use of the symbol of the crown during the early 1930s. His 1932 portrait of Hepworth, crowned head the Queen, has often been interpreted as an emblem of his desire and admiration for her, as well as a nod to the Cubist theme of playing cards. However, I believe that this painting is also Nicholson's record of Hepworth's progressive enlightenment. During this period, her letters to Nicholson are filled with references to Christian Science, reports of her weekly meetings with their practitioner, Suzanne Foxton Ferguson, and accounts of the beautiful new world that is becoming ever more apparent to her through the lens of their faith. Her letters are stamped with the image of King George V in side profile, and I believe that Nicholson is referencing this royal icon in his portrayal of Hepworth. Both images feature a crown hovering above the subject's head. The ruffled line Nicholson uses at the bottom of the crown seems to echo the ragged edge of the stamp, and the horizontal lines radiating from behind Hepworth's head are similar to the striations surrounding the king's profile. That Nicholson should make this visual analogy between Hepworth, who's undergoing this spiritual awakening, and the reigning King of England is in keeping with Christian Science rhetoric. Power, according to Mary Baker Eddy, cannot simply be endowed upon someone by lineage or decree, but is something generated from within through spiritual understanding. The official seal of Christian Science is the cross and the crown, stamped on the cover of all of the religion's literature, which Hepworth and Nicholson were regularly reading and quoting in their letters at this time. The cross represents the burden of overcoming the world of appearances through thought, and the crown is the reward for doing so, dominion over the kingdom of God that exists within us all. Eddy instructed her followers to, quote, "Take up the cross and bear it, for through it you win and wear the crown." As Sarah Jane Checkland has observed, there may also be a Christian Science basis for the strict geometrical idiom Ben employed in his later white reliefs. According to Eddy, the circle, having no beginning or end, represents spiritual or divine mind. The straight line symbolizes the materialistic, mortal mind, which adheres to the limited world of appearances. It is clear that Nicholson absorbed this semiotic code, as several of his notebooks contain Eddy's dictum that, quote, "Divine mind is perpetual motion. Its symbol is the sphere." Eddy also explains the concept of Jesus Christ in terms of this duality, where the term Jesus represents the finite earthly body, and Christ refers to the eternal spiritual idea. Hepworth's decision to use a circle as an emblem of Christ in her 1966 construction crucifixion in this context can be seen as an expression of the undying spiritual concept of Christ, rather than the broken and bloodied material body of Jesus. Hepworth was battling cancer when she made this work and was consulting Christian Science practitioners alongside conventional medicine to aid her recovery. "I wanted to go free and hang up a circle," she explained. "It seems to upset people. I find it very serene and quiet." In keeping with this theme, I believe that Winifred Nicholson's late work, Consciousness, can also be interpreted as a representation of divine mind, as symbolized by a sphere. For the most part, however, Winifred found that flowers, and the brilliant light and color that they seemed to generate, were the most appropriate vehicle for her personal spiritual outlook. "I can't think of anyone who could be a circle, not even Mrs. Eddy," she wrote to Ben. "But anyone can be a flower. It's easy. It grows and moves and enjoys being alive." For Winifred, flowers represented the secret of the cosmos. Endeavoring to paint not just portraits of flowers, but the light they convey, she marveled at their mysterious prism-like ability to turn light into rainbows, absorbing and reconfiguring the sun's rays into colors that glow with the same transcendent vibrancy of light itself. Light, in the view of Christian Science, is yet another emblem of divine mind. According to Eddy, light is a tangible symbol of life, truth, and love, and not a vitalizing property of matter. It is divine mind, Eddy insists, which, quote, paints the petal with myriad hues, glances in the warm sunbeam, arches the cloud with the bow of beauty, blazons the night with starry gems, and covers earth with loveliness. Winifred strove to capture what she called flower light in paint, arranging patterns of color and combinations that she hoped would radiate like a lamp. In her later work, Winifred used a scientific prism to study the full spectrum of color that would otherwise be imperceptible to the naked eye. In her writing, she pointed out that color, as an immaterial component of light, is not contained within the outlines of finite form, but moves and morphs throughout the world independently from matter. Sunlight, moonlight, candlelight, electric light all change the color of an object, she observed. So the local color of an object does not belong to the object. For Winifred, color represented a living energy in a state of perpetual motion and existing in a realm beyond the material. Like music or mathematics, color corresponded with an autonomous system of logic, independent from the physical world. That Winifred's theory of color was spiritually conceived is evident in her distinction between mortal and spiritual color in a letter she wrote to the Canadian physicist and biologist Glenn Schaefer in 1980. Mortal color is the photography color. Letterboxes are red, grass is green. But the spiritual, immortal part of color is the color of its inmost thought, the movement of those prismatic vibrations. A bad painter paints the color of the surface. A painter whose eyes see light paints the inside that is not exposed to the light of material seeing. Color and light were for Winifred a point of access to a broader spiritual unity. She explained to Schaefer, "Holy Ghost, the Spirit, has no line. It comes from everywhere and goes to everywhere. No boundaries, no beginning, no end, no outlines, but color. Oh yes, of course, color. So that color can be the force called in. Love has no lines, owns everything, is everywhere. Everywhere is color. All paradoxes can be surmounted by love, or shall we say, color." So what I believe Winifred was trying to do in works like this was to point to how color as a component of light or divine mind acted as a unifying force in the world. If one looked to color and how it moved and morphed independently from material bounds, one could get a sense of the spiritual unity of things beyond material appearances. And this concept was really interesting to me because one of the problems that I was grappling with in my research was trying to understand how these artists, who genuinely believed that matter was an illusion to be transcended, could reconcile this belief with the creation of material objects. Winifred found the solution to this problem by bringing color and light into her work, elements which she felt were aligned with a divine force that could not be restricted by material bounds. And I think that Hepworth began to do something similar in her approach to sculptural form during the 1930s. Just as Winifred used color to point to the spiritual unity of all things, Hepworth challenged the bounds of matter by piercing the form and sculpting not only with matter, but with light and space. If the pierced hole was conceived as an integral component of the work, then by logical extension, so too was the atmosphere surrounding the form. In this way, the sculptural idea could extend infinitely beyond its physical proportions. "Vision is not sight," she wrote. "It is the perception of the mind. It is the discernment of the reality of life, a piercing of the superficial surfaces of material existence that gives the work of art its own life and purpose and significant power." Winifred also began to experiment with the possibilities of abstract form during the 30s, developing a series of increasingly abstract images based on her 1922 painting Sacrament and Primula, which is actually on show in the gallery. This process reflects her desire to push through the veil of material appearances towards a kind of universal logic or spiritual harmony. And this focus on the abstract relationships between things, rather than the things themselves, was a central concern of hers even in her seemingly representational works. She explained to her son Jake, quote, "I can find abstract space shapes in the relationship of cloud to flower pot, or mountain peak to nearby shadow. When one does find it, it is the point where painting touches spiritual reality, the fundamental essence of things beneath, behind, beyond, and before visual experience. You don't find spiritual reality in the visual appearance of things, which is always a surface appearance. If you can find the true juxtaposition or relationship of anything to anything else, it's there at once." While Winifred ventured into form, Barbara began to experiment with the sculptural potential of color in works such as this. Here, the saturated blue pigment applied within the carved recess creates a sense of depth that pushes beyond the physical dimensions of the object. So Barbara later explained that the color in the concavities plunged me into the depth of water, caves, or shadows deeper than the carved concavities themselves. So Barbara, like Winifred, employed color as a means of transcending the physical limitations of the art object. As Ben once put it, quote, "Color exists not as applied paint, but as the inner core of an idea, and this idea cannot be touched physically any more than one can touch the blue of a summer sky." Ben also strove to arrive at a balance between color and form, object and idea in his paintings. "From Winifred, I learned so much about color," he once told a friend, "and from Barbara, a great deal about form." Drawing from their influence and the beliefs that they shared, Ben sought a point of harmony in his paintings that he explained was embedded as deeply in the material as in himself. To arrive at this point was to realize a part of spiritual reality. In 1964, he told Herbert Reed, "Perhaps the most vital point of all is that these discoveries made by artists, Mondrian, for example, were always there, and we merely reveal them. This is the Christian Science attitude, that the reality is there and that we merely have to see it. In the end, this is the point, and where Christian Science and painting link up, I think." And this kind of explicit acknowledgement of the Christian Science basis of Ben's work brings us to the last concept I want to discuss, which is how these artists believed that art could function as a positive healing force in the world. The central premise of Christian Science is that when one understands reality as a single spiritual whole, all disease, conflict, and suffering disintegrate. The realization of divine mind, according to Eddy, not only restores the believer to an ideal state of health and happiness, but unifies men and nations, ends wars, annihilates whatever is wrong in social, civil, criminal, political, and religious codes, equalizes the sexes, and leaves nothing that can sin, suffer, be punished, or destroyed. There's a sense of this kind of idealism in Ben, Winifred, and Barbara's writings that indicates that they believed that their work, in pointing to spiritual reality, could have a reparative effect on both the human body and on society as a whole. Winifred told her son Jake, who is also an artist and a Christian Scientist, quote, "We artists in vision, in beholding, have got important work to do. It is an imperative demand upon us that we heal our cities and our fellow people." Barbara told Herbert Reed that the aesthetic comprehension of fundamental rhythms in art could, quote, "aid the healing of wounds." She explained to J.P. Hoden that art could facilitate healing by demonstrating universal continuity to those who were blind to it. "Our thoughts either lead us to life and continuity," she cautioned, "or they lead us the way of the biologist applying radiation on mice, the way to annihilation. That is why it is so important that we find our complete sense of continuity, backwards and forwards, in this new world of forms and values." The reparative function of art became a particularly urgent concern for these artists during the Second World War. Suzanne Foxton Ferguson, who served as Ben and Barbara's primary Christian Science practitioner from the early 30s until her death in 1961, wrote several letters to Ben after the outbreak of war, reminding him of the important work they had to do in maintaining sight of divine mind and in helping others to do the same. Right knowing and nothing but right knowing can stop the carnage, she told him. We have to overcome evil by our knowledge of true love and real life. The concept of overcoming international conflict to unite in love and spiritual understanding would have been heightened by the fact that Ferguson was born and raised in Germany and retained a gentle German accent. In response to her instruction, Nicholson proudly sent her a copy of an essay he had just published on abstract art in the magazine Horizon that suggested that the liberation of form and color was closely linked with all the other liberations one hears about, and should therefore be listed among the nation's war aims. By freeing mortal minds from the bounds of material vision, abstract imagery from a Christian Science perspective could facilitate the resolution of all discord, including the war. Ben actually sent Ferguson a signed edition of this lithograph shortly before Britain declared war in 1939, and it's now in the possession of Ferguson's granddaughter in Canada. Hepworth once said, quote, "When there has been a threat to life, like the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima or the menace of pollution, my reaction has been to swallow despair, to make something that rises up, something that will win." And I think this speaks to the approach all three of these artists took to their work. They refused to perpetuate negativity and sorrow, seeking instead to make beauty and harmony a kind of palpable presence, a reality in people's lives. And this, for me, is at the heart of why I think an understanding of Christian Science is so important to interpreting their work, because it really highlights this kind of wonderful idealism which might not otherwise come across in its entirety. This sense that art could literally change the very nature and fabric of existence, that it could act as a powerful, transformative force for good. For Ben, Barbara, and Winifred, art served a crucial divine purpose, leading minds away from mortal material perception towards a higher spiritual truth. I have only been able to express the very simplest first letters of the alphabet of spirit, Winifred admitted in the 50s. But I've done enough to know that it's there, just beyond the realm of our consciousness. And I always know that some of us, some humans, will reach it, like the first person to fly the Atlantic. After that, all can. Thank you.
So I just want to start by thanking Eleanor and Lucy for your help and support. And also just to probably make an admission that until this conference, I'd not really looked at religion or spirituality at all in my work. So this is something of a work in progress of me drawing together different ideas. So yeah, bear with me. I'll see what I can make of it. I'm starting off with three extracts of text from Barbara Hepworth, all written in the 1950s. I won't try and read them, but yes, please do contemplate them. The boldenings are my own, and just key phrases I've picked up. So, whenever an artist does write about his work, it reveals a great deal, says Hepworth. You can open the door to a fuller understanding. If we have to follow her lead, we come to discover a large number of texts written in the 1950s and 1960s, which, to quote Hepworth, focus their attention upon the spiritual significance of the meaning of art and the purpose of the artist. A cursory textual analysis of such writings, as I've displayed here, demonstrate the pervasive use of a very controlled and deliberate vocabulary with key terminology much repeated. Words return, such as affirmative, vitality, and praise. Taking such terminology and writing as my starting point, I'm aiming to use this paper to offer some new insight into selected works from the 1950s and particularly to think about how we can use these writings to think about how this might be reflected back in forms and motifs embodied in the works. As has already been discussed by previous writers, and as Lucy's just been mentioning, Hepworth's belief system was very complex, fluctuating, and at times even contradictory. It's fine from correspondence what she might say to one person would be hugely different for another. And therefore, although I will refer in this paper to terms including Christianity, religion and Christian science, it is not the purpose of my paper to specifically identify aspects of work or thought as pertaining to one specific dogma or another. Rather, I aim to approach the work from what Margaret Timms, who interviewed Hepworth in 1959 and described as Hepworth's basic religious reverence for the whole structure of life, although she did say this was not something that was, in her words, specifically Christian. Prior to embarking on any analysis of texts and work, it is necessary to first consider what is known of Hepworth's religious or spiritual activities of the period, and why, if she wrote so many texts pertaining to this, which I've demonstrated she did, this aspect of her work has so long been left unexamined. One significant factor of contribution here is the lack of availability of Hepworth's writings in published form. This was only recently remedied with the much-awaited publication in 2015 of Sophie Bowness's Barbara Hepworth's Writing and Conversations. In keeping with this first causation is the fact that, as we can see from the extracts I've given here, many of these texts lie outside the remit of what we might call traditional art criticism. And I mean, it's interesting to look at the title of the journals these come from. We have examples of things, a journal called Ideas Today, the Christian Science Monitor, and Peace News. And interestingly, so too did the figures and relationships responsible for the sharing of such ideas and correspondence in this period. Few of them were artists at all. Instead, they included figures including the Reverend Donald Harris of St Paul's, Knightsbridge, Llewellyn Merchant, the former Dean of Salisbury, and Prior Rainier, the South African composer. In her 1998 monograph on Hepworth, Penelope Curtis spoke of the need to readjust, I quote, the story of Hepworth through restoring names of vanishing people and rounding it out by bringing in other disciplines. And it is in the spirit of this upon which I based this paper. Sir Alan Bowness suggests that the 1950s were important in establishing Hepworth's return to a more Christian orthodoxy following the Christian Science she had been practicing with Nicholson earlier on. He attributes this to the effect of personal loss, most notably that of her son Paul in 1952. This is corroborated by Hepworth herself, who opens her first letter to the Reverend Donald, stating, "I was baptised and confirmed at Wakefield Cathedral, and then later attended St Mary's Abbots. But then I got into deep water in my second marriage to Ben. After 15 years living alone, the bishop readmitted me to my church here, and the vicar of St Ives Parish Church is most helpful, so now I am happy again." Considering Tim's identification of Hepworth as not specifically Christian, some doubt may be cast on the reliability of this account of what appears to be a wholehearted move towards Christian orthodoxy. And as Lucy mentioned, Hepworth was, there is evidence showing that she was involved with Christian Science in the still on the late 1960s. Nonetheless, what is clear is the sense of a new phase of entry and a shift away from her time with Nicholson, and obviously it was in 1951 that she moved into Truan Studio permanently. So Hepworth's Library of Books, a portion of which is held at Hepworth Wakefield here, contain a large section devoted to books on religion and philosophy, and you can have a look at the titles here. Alongside a number of texts by Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, including, as Lucy mentioned, multiple copies of Science and Health, there are also annotated copies of the New Testament and the Common Book of Prayer. Also texts by Christian writers, including Kierkegaard and Teilhard de Chardin, and a selection of texts on Zen Buddhism. Many of the texts have publication dates from the late 1940s or the 50s. Again, this is evidence of the importance this decade was playing in terms of the development of her religious and spiritual thought. In addition to her correspondence with figures such as Harris and Merchant, Hepworth also became a regular member of the Congregation of St Ives during this period, and in her will she left a bequest of £2,000 to the church. And she was also, it's also interesting to note that she was also included in a number of exhibitions of a religious nature during this period. On my first slide, I gave a quotation from Moments of Vision, which was an exhibition to which she was invited to participate by Herbert Reed, and it was described as being an exhibition for contemporary artists who expressed metaphysical or spiritual intentions in their work. And another important exhibition that Hepworth and also Moore actually both in 1968 was at Coventry Cathedral, this exhibition of British sculpture. Alongside Hepworth's religious books, it's also important to note her appreciation of early English church music, which manifested itself in a collection of music books now held at the Tate Archive, the majority of which also have publication dates during this period. As I found looking in her copy of the Book of Common Prayer, which is I'm showing here, Hepworth has made annotations in the inside cover. I know that my Redeemer liveth, Handel, a reference to Handel's aria of the same title from the Oratorio of the Messiah, thus making a direct link between her religious readings and her sacred vocal music interests. When Hepworth speaks of going to church in her later letters to the Reverend Donald Harris, the presence of music is something important to her experience of the service. The church was a great and beautiful surprise and just full of music. St. Paul's was such a revelation, chalice and praise. Hepworth's copy of the Book of Common Prayer contains notes and page markers in some of the Psalms, and it is significant that her 1958 sculpture, Cantate Domino, also takes its title from Psalm number 98, O Sing Unto the Lord. In choral evensong, psalms are sung as part of the service, and therefore, alongside the word sing as translated by cantate, we've got this link between religion, music and sculpture. Cantate Domino was of very personal significance to Hepworth, and she actually hoped to make it her gravestone. However, due to council height restrictions, this was not permitted. And instead, now ascending form next to it actually is situated in the entrance to Longstone Cemetery where she is buried. As this might seem a bit of an anecdote, but as I said, I feel this is really significant in establishing this link that the importance she felt between music, religion, and her art. Music was also important to Christian Science thinking, and something that Mary Baker Eddy mentions in Science and Health, a portion of which is quoted in a copy of the Christian Science Monitor from 1966, which I found slipped inside one of Hepworth's copies of Science and Health in the library. In the quoted passage, Eddy notes, "The ear does not really hear. Divine speech reveals sound as communicated through the senses of the soul, through spiritual understanding. Mozart experienced far more than he expressed. The rapture of his grandest symphonies was never heard." Sound was also something that Hepworth very much emphasised in her own writings, particularly in reaction to a sensory experience of place. In In 1954, she took a trip to Greece, and she produced quite a lot of writings afterwards. And there's one that I found particularly interesting, where she translates her experience of going to Epidurus, where she says she hears the historian H.G.F. Kitto, and I quote, "Within the great hollow form's total silence, Kitto spoke from the arena quietly, supremely the absolute essence of the words and voice. This was hearing in its true sense, a supreme voice like the voice of God." Here, Hepworth experienced a sound, significantly in this case of total silence, punctuated by the absolute essence of the words and voice, seems to recall Eddy's teaching of sound to be communicated through the senses of the soul. Matthew Gale and Chris Stevens have spoken on the relationship between the building of Epidurus and the pierced form of the same titled sculpture, Pierced Form Epidurus 1960, which is here. Elsewhere, I have spoken about a similar, what I term a similar translation of Hepworth's phenomenological and acoustic experience from the building to the pierced sculpture. And this, I posit, could be extended to her experience of this true sense of sound. Here, also significantly spoken through the silent language of Greer Wood. To return to Cantate Domino, a number of critics, including Edward Mullins and Michael Shepherd, have likened the upward thrusting form to raised hands in prayer, whilst Hepworth herself speaks of the urge to make something that rises up, to create sculpture as a prayer. The vertical single form is a recurring motif within Hepworth's oeuvre, dating back from works in the 1930s. However, read in light of Hepworth's writings, the works that we have from on the single form motif in the 1950s may also shed other layers of meaning in accordance with Hepworth's belief system, as the material matter can be seen to be transformed into sculpture of spiritual significance. So this single upright form always had human significance, and Hepworth directly brings together the single form motif, the human figure, and sculpture in her writing, when she recalls thinking of how, I quote, "a figure rising in the distance expressed that perfect elevation of the human spirit, which in a way is conveyed by a powerful sculptured form." For Hepworth, the vertical form is also a standing form acting sentinel or guardian, she says. And in this light, the references to wings and flight found in some of the works of this period, we may also potentially read references to spiritual ascendancy. I'm particularly interested in the photography of Hepworth's sculptures in this period and their contribution to the suggestions of the religious connotations in the works. So here I actually have Hepworth and a Moor, which I will explain why in a minute. So setting was always important to significance to Hepworth, and her sculptures were often photographed with evocative backgrounds, particularly with the vistas of a St Ives Bay behind. A number of the sculptures, including Cantate Domino, as I think the photograph I showed, are photographed with the St Ives Parish Church behind them. And here, again, the church is evident in figure. What is marked is the sense of parallels, literally, between the verticals of the sculpture and that of the church. The other thing that is particularly evident is the way in these, the sculptures are raised on the plinth and actually tower over the church and come up into the sky. And because that's even more, with string figure on the right, we can really see the sense of it being above, up in the clouds. So I'm really interested in here I want to draw a comparison. I'm not suggesting necessarily influence or anything, as we've had in some earlier papers, between Hepworth's vertical forms and Moore's upright motifs. And the photograph of the moor is actually from the 1968 Coventry exhibition that I was speaking of. So obviously here we literally have it in front of the church. Interestingly, whilst much has been spoken on the upright motifs in relation, obviously they're known as the Glenkiln Cross and the reference to crucifixion, John Russell, in his monograph on Moore, actually says that he regards it as an affirmative interpretation, which obviously is exactly the same word that Hepworth uses in describing her approach to sculpture. And it's interesting that this is Moore's single standing figure of 1981, which is actually in, I'm assuming, I'm not sure if it still is, but it's in St Albans Church. And so literally in that point, in terms of thinking about display, we have the vertical form within the sacred setting. I've spoken about setting, and what I also want to speak about in relation to setting is the relationship of these vertical forms within the landscape, and reassessing the familiar notion we are aware of with Hepworth of the figure in the landscape. It is significant that when Hepworth talks of these rising figures, it is in the specific location of the landscape. In reference to curved form Trevelyan, here, she says, facing the sun across the Atlantic, where sky and sea blend with hills and rocks, to enfold the watcher and lift him towards the sky. Whilst obviously Barbara Hepworth in other writings refers to the Cornish landscape in pagan terms, it is also one that she does speak of in this period with a religious significance, and she talks about Zennor as a place to visit where we can feel at one with God and the universe. Zennor and its coastline are unique. It represents an experience which gives spiritual solace and renewed courage in a materialistic world. And it is in this line that I think I want to argue for a re-evaluation of the idea of landscape and a potential, and whether there is a significance of the religion in this. And actually, one of the things that's really interesting is, in a way, this kind of encapsulates it of Cantate Domino literally being photographed in the landscape. To draw my paper to an end, for Hepworth, I think is particularly interesting the new contexts raised and the figures who emerge, and the chance to provide new perspectives on established themes and tropes, as I said, particularly looking at that of the single form and of the landscape. And I've endeavoured to work with Hepworth's own writings of the period to think about a reading of her work through the lens of religion and the spiritual. Whilst we have been hearing earlier, obviously there is importance of mediating in terms of how literally we're going to take an artist's interpretation. However, one of the really, really delightful things about reading Hepworth's writing is, well, there's so much of it, and she does actually, in her notebooks, she refers to specific works and her interpretations of that. So we really are privileged in being able to decipher her thoughts. And I've aimed to investigate such new readings opened up through direct recourse to such writings, rather than by placing anything onto the sculptures themselves. The opening extracts I began with Hepworth speaking of what she perceived as the purpose of art in relation to making and religion, or the spiritual. Whilst these are illuminating texts, often, as we have talked about before, such texts, it's very difficult to show how they can be visually communicated in works themselves, as opposed to her writings on specific works. However, what is particularly interesting to me is to think about these views and who she discussed them with and shared these with. And in this, two significant people have emerged in my research, and one is Prior Rainier, and as you see, this is a handwritten score for Rainier's Sinfonia da Camera that she gave to Hepworth with the inscription, where, as you will see, she talks about the act of creation as being one of the divine. And it is important that Prior Rainier and Michael Tippett, another composer, were both important friends to Barbara Hepworth in the 1950s. Barbara, writing on Michael, speaks very similarly. She describes his approach to music as an act of faith, trust in the human spirit, and conception of a pure idea in both his music and his ideas on music. And Prior Rainier and Michael Tippett were also good friends, and this was a circle of network that hasn't really been much looked at with Hepworth. And I kind of want to end by thinking, as I said, these other figures who she was talking to about these matters. And it was also important in the 1950s, Hepworth did two, this is just a little bit of a epilogue, is her stage designs that she did for Michael's The Midsummer Marriage and Electra. And what I thought was really interesting is the Midsummer Marriage was described of spiritual terms and in likening to Greek tragedy. And there are certain the ideas that came up in the sculptures with the same kind of forms and the kind of the winged figures, and also in front Apollo in front of St Ives Church. And I just thought it was a really nice way of seeing how the sculptures and her ideas that I've been speaking of could be translated into other disciplines, and the interlinking of this. So thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming to listen to us today. I want to thank all the organisers at the Hepworth and Sarah and Lucy for organising this event. It's been a really stimulating day. Please bear with me as I'm the last presentation. So, I'm talking about spirituality in Kettlejard. Because most of you will have seen the exhibition upstairs, I am going to skip a little bit about what Kettlejard is and move straight onto my discussion of the subject at hand. So here's a picture of the exterior if none of you have visited, but I'll just skip through these quite quickly. That's the entrance to Kettlejard, and on the right is the first poster that was created for Kettlejard, which I think is quite sweet. Right, so all I'm going to be talking about today is the house at Kettlejard. I won't be referring to the gallery, which obviously is an integral part of the organisation now, but it's the house that is my primary concern today. Okay, so let's flick through these interiors. Here we are. So, O beauty, so ancient and so new. Thus begins the foreword to Ede's book, A Way of Life, which was first published in 1984, which in quite a particular way documents Ede's vision of Kettlejard. The phrase comes from the Confessions of St. Augustine, an early Christian theologian and saint in Catholic and Anglican faiths. In Augustine's text, from which this is excerpted, beauty and God are one and the same. Beauty is a key theme for Ede. On page 79 of A Way of Life, Ede pairs a photograph of cherry blossoms seen through the upstairs sitting window with a quote from the French political activist, philosopher and mystic Simone Weil. It's quite a long quote, but I'll read it. In ancient times, the love of the beauty of the world had a very important place in man's thought and surrounded the whole of life with marvellous poetry. Today, one might think that the white races had almost lost all feeling for the beauty of the earth, and yet at the present time, in the countries of the white races, the beauty of the world is almost the only way by which we can allow God to penetrate us. Real love and respect for religious practices are rare even among those who are most assiduous in observing them, and are practically never to be found in others. Most people do not even conceive them to be possible. On the other hand, a sense of beauty, although mutilated, distorted, and soiled, remains rooted in the heart of man as a powerful incentive. It is present in all the preoccupations of secular life. If it were made true and pure, it would sweep all secular life in a body to the feet of God. Moreover, speaking generally, the beauty of the world is the commonest, easiest, and most natural way of approach. Weil argued that the beauty we continually seek in the creative world and in relation to other human beings is, at its heart, our longing for a tangible God. Ede sought to manifest a path to spiritual growth through aesthetic experience at Kettlejard. Beauty, balance, and harmony, these are the principles of Ede's formalist vision for Kettlejard. He spent 15 years adjusting the relationship between furniture and objects as if in a composition. Barbara Hepworth called it his sculpture in space. He created a home in which art was an integral part of the fabric of life, and life a daily spiritual praxis. He made Kettlejard into a theatre of natural light and shadow. And here I've indulged myself to include a few pictures taken by Ede, but also more recently of the play of light here at Kettlejard, because it plays such an important part in the experience, animating and evoking the beauty of Dutch interiors of Vermeer or Pieter de Hooch, for instance, in a scene like this. In his 1931 radio talk entitled Space to Live In, Ede declared, "Always in daylight, the window is the most beautiful thing in your room, for through it comes the light without which no visual beauty could exist. Whether it's wet or whether the sun shines, the content of that light, dazzling or subdued, is always beautiful." So he's obviously not unaware of the spiritual and symbolic significance of light, but it's the primary function of its illuminating the beauty in the place that's part of his formalist concerns there. He drew attention to the beauty in everyday life, too, from the rhythms of eating, working, and sleeping, to rituals of cleaning and cooking, making the beds, and tending the plants. Ede also took over the daily maintenance of the tiny Norman church next door to Kettlejard, which you can see here, and raised funds by selling his Brancusi, the Poisson d'Or, to repair its roof. As part of his daily routine, he rang the Angelus there twice a day. In a letter to applicants of the post of resident, which would be his successor, he wrote, "It was a daily joy to get those 3 to 4 minutes at 8 and at 6, to walk up that little path and to go into that quiet space of stillness and ring out the bell of welcome to all the neighbours. Kettlejard is something far more important than the objects which the place contains, and St. Peter's is far more important to Kettlejard than the exhibition gallery and all the telephones." The Edes moved into Kettlejard in 1956. Jim was 61 and Helen was 62. They'd reached a point in their lives where spirituality was more important than ever. Ede had grown up in a Welsh Methodist family, but his religious predilections were rather more ecumenical. Kettlejard contains 2 Buddhas, there's one, perhaps harking back to his time in India during World War I, and his library contains, amongst other books, a 1915 copy of the Quran and a large proportion of books by various mystics, poets and philosophers, from Thomas Merton, Rilke, to Lao Tzu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. A Way of Life includes quotations from William Blake to Ramakrishna. Early correspondence with artists and friends dating back to the 20s reveals evidence of spiritual searching and a pantheistic belief in the interconnectedness of everything, a lively interest in both Eastern and Western religions and philosophies. So Alan Bowness once observed that at Kettlejard, the values that the paintings and sculptures stand for are translated into everyday living. So let's consider this for a moment. Think of some of the key figures in the collection. Ben Nicholson, who, according to Helen Sutherland, was utterly absorbed in the adventure both of painting and living. He insisted that living and painting must be one thing. Brancusi and Gaudier Brzeska, Brancusi on the left here, key exponents of direct carving, an intuitive relationship with materials. The untrained Alfred Wallace, whose painting is at the bottom there, who painted from memory of lived experience, unburdened by stylistic conceits, and Christopher Wood, who made Wallace his master. Jean Cocteau wrote of Wood's paintings, "Before the canvas, you don't think, you live." I've shown this one here because the painting at the top is the Christopher Wood, and below is the Wallace, and this relationship was, these pieces were hung together in this way in Wood's studio. It's a pairing that Ede copied when Wood died and the works came to Kettlejard. Right. Also, Winifred Nicholson, who, according to Ede, paints a pot of flowers and in it you feel the laws of universal birth. It isn't just for flowers growing, it's the whole life of nature. And David Jones, whose work for Ede had that special quality which is his wholeness, a unity with life. There are few people living today who, in presenting a work of art, an admixture of the artist's whole being as part of the whole universal concept, have probed so deeply nor achieved so clear an expression as he has. You get a sense that they're trying to get beyond material appearances to connect with some essential reality, and it's a short leap from the mystical universal birth and unity with life to something more explicitly divine. Kettlejard contains various references to the divine in artworks from David Peace's Sanctuary Lamp, Vere Dominus et in loco isto, which means in truth God inhabits this place, or Richard Pousset Dart's Symbolic Circles. Sure, I've included this picture. The originals are actually upstairs. This shows the original group of 8 discs in 1970. Unfortunately, there are no longer 8 at Kettlejard. Ede met Pousset Dart, who was a member of the New York School and first-generation abstract expressionist in New York in November 1940. So I'll go back there for a second. A close friendship developed rapidly and took on a religious tone. A week after their first meeting, Pousset Dart wrote to Ede, "Dear Mr. Ede, before me, lying on the table, are 2 lovely little shells which you so kindly brought me. I like best the smaller of the 2. It is exquisite. How the universe, how God is revealed in this little bit of symmetry." On the 10th of December, Pousset Dart wrote again, "The stone we found in Central Park is yours if you care for it, and whichever one of us possesses it, it is ours, for we did find it together. We did see God within a stone." So it's this stone that I don't know whether it came to Kettlejard, but I'm sure many of you are aware of the significance of the pebbles at Kettlejard. Ede wrote once an essay on them, and Ian Hamilton Finlay declared it the Louvre of the pebble. The image here is a pebble spiral created by Ede in 1958. Pousset Dart had began to use the circle and the spiral in his work as symbolic forms representing interconnectedness of life, God, and the universe. He made Ede the first of the several circular forms that he would give to him, a small brass disc, in February 1941. He wrote to Ede, "I trace your circle, I give you yourself. I have made you the greatest window upon God, a symbol of infinity. No circle can duplicate mine, though 10,000 like one be drawn. This is the individuality of God, which makes all likeness differ and all difference one. We are all born to become circles, and in the individuality of ourselves we are God." On the right is a photograph of Ede taken by Pousset Dart holding the brass disc made for him, and Ede used this image in publicity for his lecture tours in the States during the 40s. Ede also used artworks to demonstrate particular ideas, formal relationships, which would often exclude other interpretations. In the case of a work like Murau's Tick Tick, which you see on the right, the installation view is on the left, Ede interpreted it in essentially formal terms and rarely mentioned the work's surrealist origins. The conversation between the yellow spot in the painting and the lemon on the pewter dish close by is characteristic of Ede's precise choreography of formal elements throughout the house. These formal relationships, however, carry spiritual significance. As Ede wrote in A Way of Life, the mural was to me an opportunity to show undergraduates the importance of balance. If I put my finger over the spot at the top, right at all the rest of the picture slid into the left-hand bottom corner. If I covered the one at the bottom, horizontal lines appeared, and if somehow I could take out the tiny red spot in the middle, everything flew to the edges. This gave me a much-needed chance to mention God, and by saying that if I had another name for God, I think it would be balance, for with perfect balance, all would be well. David Jones is, of course, Ede's spiritual cornerstone at Kettle's. His Kia per Incarnati from circa 1953 was reproduced as the first cover of the printed guide to Kettle's. The inscription's translated as, "For by the mystery of the word made flesh, the light of thy brightness has shone anew into the eyes of our mind. Minerva has sprung from the head of Jove." According to Jones's explanation on the back of the work, this phrase comes from the preface of the Mass of the Nativity, also used on the feasts of Corpus Christi, when it provided a liturgical link between the word made flesh in the stable and what is made present at the Mass. The words around the margin express the eternal generation of the Son from the Father. Of Jones's calligraphic works, Ede wrote in 1954, "One does not need to know Welsh or Latin or whatever language may have been chosen. One does not need to read the words. One needs only to look at the curves and strokes and diagonals which have been worked together in this paint, on this piece of paper. To read, if one has not looked, is to miss the point." Ede's point being, and this was one of the central tenets of his approach to art, that you can still see something if you don't know what it means, and a lack of knowledge is no hindrance to engaging with art or understanding one's place in the world. But Jones's reference to the sacramental function of liturgy and the relationship between God and man expressed here is profoundly meaningful at Kettle's, where Ede saw himself as an instrument of God. As the editor who worked with him on A Way of Life wrote, he never felt it was his creation, he just put things where they seemed to belong. David Jones's spiritual vision appealed to Ede. This is a Jones in the entrance hall at Kettle's, note the spiral staircase, and provided a frame for his eventual religious conversion to the Anglican Church in 1959. According to Simon Barrington Ward, who was the chaplain at Magdalen College, Ede, as a pantheist, seeing the divine in everything and ourselves as a part of that, caught hold of David Jones's vision of the sacrament of humanity. Again, Barrington Ward, he liked very much me quoting Irenaeus to him. God became human that we might become divine. People could come into Kettle's and catch a vision that was deepening and sharpening as he was making it. He was trying to live and be and make what was right, and in doing that to open the eyes and hearts and minds and imaginations of others. Barrington Ward described Ede's feeling for the Christian as a way into this sacramental sense, of the Eastern sense, of the wholeness of everything, the incarnation being a particular expression of a particular way of opening into the divine. Ede embraced the idea of divine love pervading everything. His original title for his book, A Way of Life, was A Way of Love, and the sacramental as the way Christian faith points to a vision of the whole. Barrington Ward again. He saw this as something that he was actually expressing and embodying in the house, in the way the works of art were arranged and organised. As a kind of lighter way of life, everything had this rightful place. The interrelation of the different bits of furniture and different items, as it were, was a kind of harmony and a pattern and a wholeness that people must learn both to discern and try to create more in themselves and their lives and everything. One of the many poetic thoughts interspersed through A Way of Life is simply a reference to the book entitled The Sacrament of the Present Moment, which is attributed to the French Jesuit priest and writer Jean-Pierre de Caussade, 1675 to 1751, if anyone's interested. also known as Abandonment to Divine Providence. This 300-year-old text encourages a selfless abandonment to God as a means to conquer pride and ego and achieve grace or a holy state, a notion that has shades of Eastern religions such as Zen Buddhism and would appeal to Ede's unconventional blend of Eastern and Western religious ideas. This and various other religious texts serve to contextualize both Ede's praxis as a way of life at Kettleyard and the numinous contemplative state which he worked so hard to create for visitors. Jones was not the only friend of Ede's to embrace Catholic mysticism and the notion of the sacrament. This is an inscription which hung in the hall at Cockley Moor, which was the home of another of Ede's closest friends, Helen Sutherland, the collector and patron of early 20th century British art. She lived there between 1939 and 65, and the inscription is by Charles Péguy from the Basic Verities, a French poet and philosopher. Ede first met Sutherland in 1926. They shared a passion for contemporary art and music and strong religious convictions, which they discussed at length in their correspondence, which lasted over 50 years. As Val Corbett has written, the communication between Ede and Sutherland was frequently profound. It was also a kind of stream of consciousness, which is why I have neglected to include a quote here, because I think it only makes sense to the reader. By the time Sutherland moved to Cockley Moor in Cumbria in 1939, she had become a devout Catholic, having previously spent 20 years as a Quaker. She commissioned the young architect Leslie Martin to design a long, light-filled extension to Cockley Moor. Martin also designed the extension to Kettle's Yard in 1967, in which the quality of light is particularly subtle and varied. Like Ede, Sutherland favoured white-painted rooms left uncurtained. I'll move back so you can see that. Many paintings were stacked on the floor or propped along bookcases, again like Ede. As he'd said in A Space to Live In, a picture standing on the floor generally looks better than hanging on the wall. You find there that it can be moved at any moment, and so you're eager to look at it while it is there. Both Sutherland and Ede had ideas about the ceremony and surroundings of religious ritual too, reconfiguring their places of worship, respectively, according to their own aesthetic preferences. Sutherland bought a new carpet for her church because she thought the red carpet vulgar. She bought a blue one. And Ede persuaded Barrington Ward to strip out the wood panelling and Victorian altar and reduce everything in the altar to a very puritanical, sort of Cistercian, white, simple environment. As the inscription in her hall suggests, Sutherland lived an ascetic lifestyle with its routines and rules that house guests were expected to adhere to. For instance, she insisted that everyone sleep with the window open all year round. According to Winifred Nicholson, she subsisted on cold baths, long walks, and ate nothing but lettuce and pineapple. Ede had similarly Spartan habits. He insisted on guests taking cold baths too, but this was to avoid steam damaging the paintings in the bathroom. He prided himself on thrift, and they served plain food, partly due to Ede's intestinal problems, and partly because Ede had a habit of using Helen's housekeeping money to support an artist in crisis. Ede detested electric light. He went to bed at sunset and rose at dawn. And in the context of such beautiful surroundings at Cockley Moor or Kettle's Yard, their monastic lifestyles take on a kind of aesthetic timbre. And as you can see, Helen Sutherland is like a sounding board for Ede, with many of these ideas in terms of a sort of praxis. So Martin's brutalist architectural language, we'll go back to Kettle's Yard now, and pared down palette of natural materials provided a sensitive backdrop that allowed both Ede and Sutherland to pair their collections of early 20th century art with an aesthetic interior language of material austerity, of bare wood and stone, whitewashed walls, and clean, clear spaces, a kind of equivalent for the essential formal qualities of the artist's work that also reflected the collector's simple and spiritual way of life. So looking at Kettle's Yard in this light then, as both a place and a way of life, we can see Ede's project as enactment and embodiment of divine unity between art, life, and God. Thank you.
Thank you for those fascinating papers, and we really are quite pressed for time, so I'm going to offer questions. I'm going to open it up to the floor first of all, and I will, if I have time, ask my questions at the end. So, yes.
I was interested this morning in the idea of the one built environment where these artworks might be placed. And this afternoon it's been very interesting hearing you talk about Kettle's Yard. But I was thinking as well with Nicholson, it was how they last week in London part of the house to the Rudolf Steiner building off Baker Street. And the colour scheme there and this luminescent layering of colouring that reminded me of Windsor Nicholson. I'm just wondering if any of you can think of other sort of interiors or indeed exteriors of buildings that reflect what's been discussed today in terms of mysticism and spirituality in non-religious buildings.
I think maybe Alistair Morton's House at Brackenfell. Is that?
Yes, possibly. I have to confess also that this is also my first time in thinking about Kettle's Yard in terms of spirituality. I used to work at Kettle's Yard for 9 years, and it was almost a taboo subject to discuss the G word. To overlook the religious text in a way of life. It's basically a picture book, isn't it? But there are no. So, in my research on Kettle's Yard, I haven't looked at many other religious buildings to compare Kettle's Yard to. I've looked at other collectors' homes and institutions, both in Europe and the US. But no, I can't talk to that really.
You do get a sense, though, that Nicholson and Barbara and Winifred were all very concerned with the interiors of their studios, with the interiors of their homes, and sort of arriving at this sort of balance in their own rooms that helped align their minds, I think, in their view, with this sort of universal harmony that they were constantly trying to attain in their thinking. And in Unit 1, Barbara Hepworth's statement is actually, a huge amount of it is about the placement of objects in her studio, and how this is far more than just about working in a certain way, but it's a way of life, it's a way of existing in the world.
So I thought you were talking about colour and religious context. Did I misunderstand?
Yes, no, colour is a bit, well, everything is any interior is of interest, but yes, the colour of interiors as well, and that's why with Winifred Nicholson, it's colour in her paintings. So I was thinking in the Rudolf Steiner in the auditorium, it's this layering of colour, it's actually colour in the interior, but obviously the Alistair Morton, Helen Sutherland, Ginny, it's a more Cistercian, Spartan approach, that the colours in the works rather than in the interior.
Yeah, but interesting, in Ede's lectures, when he was doing the lectures in the 30s and 40s, he did a lecture on Ben Nicholson and included an image of Ben Nicholson's mantelpiece from the studio, showing the arrangement of things.
Yes.
As a practicing artist and as someone who's endeavouring to practice the teachings of Christian Science, I would really like to thank you for the very sensitive and thoughtful papers that we've heard today. Knowing what the subject was, one is obviously slightly anxious as to how it's going to be represented, and I think you did it so beautifully and so fairly, and I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Yes.
That was really interesting, so very amazing. But you mainly spoke about Barbara Hepworth's work in relation to her religious views, more to do with her sculpture and therefore abstract work. But have you any thoughts about, say, her operation scenes and how it could be thought about in the same way?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a sort of controversy as to who came up with this idea of her going into the surgical theatre, whether it was her or Norma Kapner. And she obviously had a huge respect for medical practitioners of all varieties. But One account is that Norman Capener offered her this opportunity and she was completely horrified, and according to Capener, she approached him, so it's difficult to say. But she was very adamant that she would only look at reconstructive surgery because she didn't want any sort of element of destruction. And she focuses on these works on sort of the hands and the eyes of the surgeons and the nurses working in a kind of mental unity, and that's how she talks about them as a sort of constructive event. And there isn't, I don't think, a huge amount of difference between the hospital drawings and her abstract sculptures of the time. It's still about this force of sort of minds coming together for a singular purpose. Sorry, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Okay. I was just going to touch on how the second two papers spoke about the way in which things are exhibited or photographed in your case. And I was thinking about the what you spoke about with light in the first paper, and how something that always strikes me when you see Ben Nicholson's reliefs is the darkness that you get rather than the light, and the way that it's lit and the way it's exhibited. Can you tie those two strands together at all about how they're exhibited, their concerns to do with light, and
how Nicholson's work.
How they're exhibiting the work of Nicholson and Winifred and Ben, as well as Hepworth. Is it something that they thought about with regard to their Christian Science beliefs or not?
I'm sorry.
You mean in the sense that sort of darkness becomes integral to the works?
It's clearly a major part of the way you exhibit the work, how it's lit and how it's arranged.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about unity altogether. So they're dealing with how, so when Hepworth works with form and matter, it's her trying to pull together this idea that mind or spirit pervades everything and how these things lock together. And I think that's what Nicholson is doing when he uses light in his work too. He's dealing with light and shadow as a complete unity in the work. Sorry, I'm not sure.
I think Hepworth certainly talks a lot about the qualities of light in terms of sculpture and particularly natural light, and I mean, like, she hates like dull galleries. I mean, it's not really exactly what you're asking, but I think that's very important to her, certainly, and that's one of the things that she talks about in the garden.
I might just add one little thing. I remember she and Jimmy had an ongoing conversation about a particular sculpture because they argued over the base that she'd made for it, and she wanted a lacquered black base for 3 personages, actually, which Jim felt was a little too shiny. And in the end, he replaced it with slate. Barbara Hepworth was very unhappy about this. So they agreed to disagree. But
can I ask something in that case, which is just, you've given these fascinating papers about aspects, well, 2 of you, about aspects of Hepworth's work which seem to fit together quite clearly in interesting ways. I just wonder if both of you could say something about the kind of ways that your papers might speak to each other about Hepworth's work.
Yeah, well, I think the fact that we're both bringing out these very different sides of Hepworth's spirituality speaks to the sort of fluidity of religion during the 20th century in general. I mean, it's very frustrating for the art historian, but also, I suppose, the fun of it, that is never as simple as figuring out that an artist was interested in Christian Science and then sort of dusting your hands of the situation. Because even an artist who seems a sort of cut and dry Christian Scientist, as Winifred Nicholson, in that she was going to church services and engaging with the church, she sort of veers into spiritualism when she is communicating with the spirit of Christopher Wood, and she's also involved in Eastern religions, and Hepworth is no different. But you really get the sense that instead of these influences being mutually exclusive, that she's sort of collecting influences and figuring out how they align and how to add them to her philosophy. And so I think that's really interesting that Clare is sort of picking up after the war and seeing how these ideas morphed.
I think the other thing I'd say is that I specifically, when I put my abstract and I just said post-war, and then I got to the point I thought I'm just going to have to do the 50s because there's so many different strands that I think, because it is so complex, like Lucy says, I did limit myself to one decade because even within that there was just so many different strands to pick up on.
Okay, are there any final questions? Sarah, I thought, okay, one at the back and then Sarah.
I've been trying to figure out if the question about mysticism has been answered. I'm not sure it has. I was just wondering if it was the view of the panellists. I mean, for all the presentations today, is it possible to say that somehow the presentation of this mystical thing, the ineffable, is now, these artists dealt with it in a more sophisticated way than the previous 1900 years of Christian artists ever did?
Well, for my own part, I certainly don't think that the claim or the interest of kind of bringing the modern and the mystical or the religious together is to say that modern artists have somehow kind of bettered the history of dealing with the subject. It's more, a question of finding new forms for dealing with the subject, given changed circumstances, given, the ways that old motifs and old kind of formats are no longer really sustaining conviction, would be one way to put it.
Perhaps another way of putting the question is, have they abandoned the idea of a personal God?
Yeah, well, I'm going to open that up to everyone else.
Sorry, so this is stuck. What do you mean by a personal God?
The idea of a God as a redeemer, as a saviour of people from sin, and the very personal representations of God, well into the 19th century certainly. You still have the idea of a bearded old gentleman sitting on top of a cloud.
Of course, to Stanley Spencer, he was unknowable.
Yeah, I think the problem is that there are so many versions of God still continuing on into this thing. We've seen artists like, Amrep and Gill, for my part, and many others still creating these representations of God, Spencer himself, but in a very different form. So I'm not sure if you want to say something, Sarah, about...
Probably not. I think it's difficult to answer in any broad terms because it's so specific. You really have to look at what each individual artist is saying about their work and what religions they're engaging with, because you do get this sense that there's this kind of freedom to custom make a religion to suit your own needs and your own interests during this period. So
Yeah, and certainly what Jimmy was trying to do at Kettleshard was, I suppose, redemption, or to solve the problems, let's say, of modern life, or to respond to them with a kind of spiritual quest. I think in that sense he's quite close to the Christian Science philosophy, where the problems of the world will be healed if one can achieve this state of enlightenment through a practice that involves art and aesthetics.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, I'm a carver and a leather cutter. And as far as I'm concerned, this God thing is actually when you feel it's right. You feel you've got it right. And that's because of all the things you've thrown away or whatever. You work towards something which you feel is right, and that's the God thing as far as I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. It's not about, it's what you mean by God, basically.
yeah.
Spirituality or whatever.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that's sort of what Nicholson is getting at when he talks about finding something embedded as deeply in the material as in himself. And it's this idea of sort of reconciling these intuitive personal rhythms with some sort of external force sort of found in the grain of the wood, and finding some sort of continuity between those things.
It's a kind of aha moment.
Yeah.
Do you think Bertrand Russell's series of essays on why I am of history had the influence anywhere over that?
Not that I'm aware of with these particular artists, but I mean, I think his essays on mysticism certainly had a huge influence on Roger Fry. I think his essay on mysticism and logic had a big influence on Roger Fry, and this idea, that
I think they knew each other, didn't they?
Yeah, they were both Cambridge apostles. And Russell actually had something of a mystical conversion at the beginning of the 20th century, which I think sort of faded slightly after the First World War, but he certainly had a moment.
And what about Kathleen Raine? Because she had a relationship with Nicholson, didn't she?
Right, yeah, there's some evidence that...
Indeed, I think it was a poem. She wrote a poem for her.
Oh, a poem.
Kathleen wrote a poem.
For Winifred. They had a close relationship, and there's evidence in Winifred's letters that she says she's given Kathleen Raine and Ben Nicholson this thing, but they still make such a mess of their lives, and I think what she's alluding to is that she's tried to teach them these principles of Christian Science, but they've sort of veered off course in one way or another. And yeah, I know Kathleen Raine was also involved in the spiritualist magazine Light, and so it seems like she was sort of engaging with a number of different doctrines herself.
There's a lovely statue for Kathleen Raine by Gertrude Hermans here in the former exhibition, wasn't there? Yes? Lovely. I like her poetry as well.
I'm sure many of us do. And, well, thank you, everyone. We should really, we're just going to have a final comment, but if we could just join me in thanking our panellists one more time.
Thank you all for coming today as well, and I hope you found it as rich and engaging as I have. I mean, there's an incredible amount of material to work through there. My hope, of course, because I run an art gallery, is that you'll all be back to come and look at what we keep putting on upstairs. There's no substitute for having an experience in front of a work of art. You all know that, but I hope you will keep coming back. I've no doubt there's so many threads in what all of the people involved in giving papers today have provided in terms of thinking for our future programme, whether it is further debate or indeed whether it could manifest in terms of things that we need to be exhibiting upstairs. I immediately feel I've got to find the Shackleton from the collection and get that out. But thank you for your interest today, and I hope you'll enjoy the final few days of the Spencer show and be back for what I think is just going to be a fantastic programme over the next 12 months. I mean, I guess I'd be out of a job if I said anything less, but I think it's the best set of shows that the gallery has yet had. Some really wonderful things coming up. They're going to be all announced soon, but I hope you get a chance to come back here regularly, and thank you for coming today. But huge thank you to all of you for all of that work in preparing papers and sharing your thoughts and ideas with us. I think it's such a rich set of ways in which to basically ask a lot more of the works of art that we encounter. I do worry on occasion that perhaps we haven't set the bar high enough for what we now expect from works of art. I mean, it's wonderful that we get a very broad media interest. The quality of the debate in that media interest I often find pitifully low, and I think today was a massive antidote to that. So thank you to the panelists, and thank you for you all for coming today. So enjoy whatever you're going to do for the rest of the weekend. We're open tomorrow.